This is the slideshow to Chapter 3, Key Issue 1, dealing with migration. And it is dealing with the question, where are migrants distributed? This is a companion resource for my students to the Rubenstein textbook. So a couple terms to know. One, mobility. Mobility is most generalized as a term that refers to all types of movements, especially concerning humans. Here, we're not talking about necessarily human beings moving to another place permanently. We're talking about journeying each day to work or school, weekly visits to local shops, maybe going to the grocery store as a weekly ritual, annual trips to visit relatives, go see grandma who might live in a different state, or perhaps you go on a vacation to the same place every year. Short-term and repetitive acts of mobility are referred to as circulation. And a great example here would be college students who would move away to a different town to attend college each fall and then return home each spring. They're not migrants because they're coming back home. They might go live somewhere for a time, but it's for a specific purpose and it's for a specific amount of time. Now, a permanent move to a new location constitutes migration. There's two different types of, or two words I should say, that describe migration. One of them is immigration with an E, and that's migration from a location. The other is immigration with an I, and that's migration to a location. Now you may be thinking, how is there a difference? If you're doing one thing, you should be doing another. And that's mostly true, unless of course you leave a country and I guess become a traveler and you never stop any one place. But the purpose of this is so we can understand and focus on the effects of that person on a particular country, whether they're coming in or leaving the country, as well as the effects of that country on that person. So the way I remember this, just to make it easy, immigration has an E for exit, and the other one has an I for into. So you leave somewhere or you go into somewhere. And that's just how I remember it. Now, the difference between the number of immigrants and the number of emigrants is a place's net migration. This is an important term because the net migration of a place can tell us about whether that place has push factors or pull factors. Of course, places can have both, but what does it predominantly have? If it's got a negative net migration, if it has a net out migration, then that means it's probably got a lot of push factors and not many pull factors. A lot of reasons for people to leave and not many good reasons for them to come. Here is net migration for UK over the years. As we've seen, though it has gone up and down, the general trend since 1991 has been more people moving in than moving out. This is a pretty nice place to be. Nice weather, pretty safe. Not the best food, but you can always find good Indian food there. It's not a bad place to live. In fact, it's a pretty nice place to live. All right, now here is just a little chart showing net migration and the negatives for Syria. And this, of course, would be an extreme case because Syria has succumbed to violence and civil war, and so people are doing nothing but getting out of there. Ravenstein, and just as you would have imagined, he looks like every other dead white guy. He was a 19th century geographer who wrote a series of what are called laws But really, these are just theories, and this is about the tendencies of migrants. Let's go through them. Number one, most people migrate for economic reasons. So most migration is voluntary, and it is with the intent of making more money. Most migrants relocate a short distance and remain within the same country. Again, when we're asking if these things are still true, we have to think, are they likely to be true? And if we're dealing with human actions, the easiest things are those that are likely to be true, aside from any other more potent reasoning. And in this case, yeah, it's much easier to migrate short distances than it is to migrate long distances or international ones. And people will still migrate short distances for economic reasons. You might be living in Kenya in a village, and you may be likely to migrate to Nairobi, to the city, to get a job, to make more money than you can make in agriculture. And so even if you're not moving internationally, you still may move for economic reasons. Long distance migrants to other countries head for major centers of economic activity. Again, what motivates people? Making money. And so you're more likely to get a good job moving to a city. You're not going to move all the way across the world just to be a farmer again. And in fact, if you're trying to be a farmer in a more developed country, you're likely to face even a greater challenge because we don't need as many farmers. We have more technology. Although there are some forms of agriculture that still require a human touch. And that's why you will see migrant workers in places like California, for instance, or Florida. Most long-distance migrants are male. This is because males traditionally are the ones who leave the home and work to get money. Women are preoccupied with raising children, and of course there are social stigmas with that. And as a student pointed out, there are increased risks for women who are traveling, unfortunately. Most long-distance migrants are adult individuals rather than families with children. This comes down to what is the working age, right? If most people are moving or migrating for economic reasons, that means the people that are migrating are those who can work. So we're not going to be including big families in this because it's really expensive to migrate. It's really difficult. And if you're migrating your whole family, well, you probably need to have a lot of money saved up to do that. Most long-distance migrants are young adults seeking work rather than children or elderly people. Of course, if you are an old person, you are less likely to rearrange your life to make a huge life change like moving to another country or moving a long distance. And you're less likely to be able to get a job as an older person. And the truth is, many of these jobs, most of these jobs that long distance migrants are taking are those that the naturalized citizens, those who are already in the country and were born in that country, they're those jobs that those people don't want. Okay, more of the manual labor jobs. It don't necessarily require greater education. Now, I do not want to leave out the fact that a lot of people do travel who are highly educated. I shouldn't say travel, but migrate, who are highly educated. They come to places like the United States and work in universities and hospitals and research labs. So I don't want to leave those people out. But a lot of migration is people who are willing to work lower level, lower paying jobs. And the reason is because they can make more money than they would have in their own country. Two categories of migration, international and internal. and they are just what you might think. International is between countries, so moving from one country to another. Internal is moving within that country. So breaking it down further, you can have voluntary international migration and you can have forced international migration. Voluntary refers to migration where people decide to move, and that's usually to make more money. They could stay if they wanted, they could continue living their lives where they are, but they see a greater opportunity. Forced migration gives the sense that they don't have a choice. If they stay, their livelihood is at risk. They're in danger. Now, this could be because of political persecution. Maybe they are a religious minority, or maybe they have spoken out against the government and their government is out to get them. It could also be due to natural factors. Perhaps there's a hurricane where they lived and there's no clean water, there's no way for them to continue living there. Now, keep in mind, this is where people become refugees. And to be a refugee, the government basically has to decide that you cannot stay where you are and you need to take asylum in another country. And by that I do mean the government that is receiving you. If you're just displaced within your own country, like victims of Hurricane Katrina were, and had to move from Louisiana and Mississippi to places like Georgia and Tennessee, those are not refugees. Those are internally displaced persons because they're still in the same country. Internal migration can be either interregional or intra-regional. The way that I remember the difference is that if you are moving interregionally between regions, you'll take the interstate. Now, of course, you could fly, but that's just how I remember. If you're driving and you're moving to another region, you'll take the interstate. One last thing is remember that there is a gray area between voluntary and forced migration. It often comes down to what the government is willing to believe. I may say that I have to move because my family will starve because I can't make enough money, but the government may say, no, that's not provable. You could get a better job in your own country. So it is a gray area. Here's just a quick example of international versus internal migration. You see in purple we have international, and then in red you have internal interregional because it's between regions but in the same country. And in orange there, it's movement within the same region. And so it's intra-regional. About 9% of the world's people are international migrants. That means that about 9% of our population on Earth is living in a country other than where they were born. They have moved permanently or semi-permanently to another country. And when we say moved permanently, we don't mean they necessarily have to die in that country. They have to live in there the rest of their lives. But they've moved there with no intention of moving back, no plans for moving elsewhere. That is what we mean when we refer to someone as a permanent migrant. Global pattern reflects migration tendencies from developing countries to developed countries. This just makes sense. If you have the means, you may want to move to a nicer country, a place that's better to live, has more opportunities, more places to shop, more places to eat, but most importantly, better paying jobs, better access to resources like hospitals. The regions of Asia, Latin America, and Africa overall have net out migrations, meaning more people are moving out of those nations, or excuse me, those regions than are moving in. North America, Europe, and Oceania, which includes Australia and New Zealand, all highly developed regions of the world, and so they're going to have a high net in migration. Keep in mind, this isn't saying anything about population levels. People are leaving Asia. It might have a net out migration. That doesn't mean their population's going down. It's just talking about migration. This shows global migration patterns in a visual way. Note that those countries in red have net in migration. Those in blue have net out migration or negative net migration. The largest arrows show the greatest flows. And so we do see the greatest flows going into North America, also into Europe. But a lot of people from North America, even people from Europe moving into North America. The United States has more foreign-born residents than any other country. Approximately 40 million, which is 13% of the US population. Now, that includes people who are non-citizens. Three main eras of immigration in the US. The first era was the colonial settlement in 17th and 18th centuries. Europe and sub-Saharan Africa were the main places that people came from. Most of the ones from Africa were forced to migrate as slaves. Now, the second era was the mass European immigration. This is where more and more people came in droves from Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that would be the 1800s and the early 1900s. In the beginning of this second era, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. But by the turn of the 20th century, most migrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And your book describes this, the reasoning for this, in part, is that the Industrial Revolution hit these regions at different times, starting, of course, in England, and then moving north, and then south and further east in Europe. And when it hit those places, the populations began to increase because people could live longer with better medicine and more access to food. And so the populations may have outpaced the jobs and the resources that were available. The third era is when Asian and Latin American integration in the late 20th and early 21st centuries ramps up. It marked a shift in the sending continents. Which continents are sending the most people? And so today, Asia and Latin America are the main places where people come from to enter the United States. This graph shows the number of immigrants in millions to the United States since the 1820s, broken down by decades. And we see a steady and dramatic increase from the 1930s all the way up to the 1910s. Then it starts to decrease. We have the Great Depression, and of course, with people struggling to put food on their own plates in the United States, we were not very open to letting more people come over, and then a dramatic decrease. It stays very low for about a decade during the 40s. Of course, we have war going on, and then after the Second World War, we see that increase again. But notice the difference in where people are coming from. Where it was Europe for the first half of the 20th century, more and more people started coming from Asia and Latin America. Very small percentage of people are coming from Oceania. I don't even know if you can see that. That's, of course, because it's not a very populated area. This is where people are going. Destinations of immigrants by U.S. state. When we look at this, we may want to think about where people are coming from, and that should help us understand. We have a lot of people going to California, a lot of people going to Texas, and a lot of people going to Florida, among other places. Well, we know that um, the Latin world is in proximity close to these places. And we also know that there's something called chain migration, which is a phenomenon by which people are likely to migrate somewhere that they know someone, that someone has already migrated to. And people from Mexico and other parts of Latin America have been moving to places like Texas and California, well, since before they were even part of the United States. And so it makes sense that people would continue to move there. They're going to move to where they have family or where they have friends or where they have a connection. And of course, people from Cuba have been moving to Florida for a very, very long time, and so we see chain migration there as well. But there are political reasons for some of this. Some of these states are more open to migrants. Some of them are not very open to migrants. Some of them are spatially very far away from the major centers of migration where people are leaving, and so you're not going to see as many people there. But looking at this should surprise you, especially in the modern world. Distance isn't necessarily the biggest factor. A lot of times the factor is, can I get a job there? Do I know people there? Here is Wilbur Selinsky, and now you're going to have nightmares. So Selinsky created the, oh, sorry, I kind of messed that up. Oh well, we'll just roll with it. He created the migration transition model. It closely follows the demographic transition. So we've seen a lot of stuff build off of the demographic transition. So if you don't know what that is, really should focus on it. Oh man, I really am sorry about the nightmares you're going to have about Wilbur Zelinsky. Stage one is a pre-modern traditional society. Okay, large amounts of seasonal migration. People are moving with the herd, with their livestock, but there's little to no permanent migration. Okay, people aren't moving to live somewhere specific. This is hunter-gatherer societies. You're not likely to find a country in this stage. Though you will have some nomadic peoples that may, in places like North Africa, living in the Sahel, these groups are dwindling in size. They're getting smaller and smaller, but it may still exist in some places. Stage two is early transitional society. This is where you have internal movement, a high rate of rural to urban migration. Okay, this is happening all across sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, all across Asia. People are moving into the cities. Why? Because these cities are where industry is taking place. Cities are where people can get a better job. Now, it's not that people are just greedy and all want more money. Of course, we do know that more money can make your life easier. But as the societies become more industrialized, that means their agriculture is more industrial, which means people can't make as much of a living doing agriculture as they once could because many of their jobs are taken by machines. And in stage two, internationally, we have a high rate of immigration. A lot of people are leaving these places. Again, if you can move to a better country, you often will. In stage three, which is the late transitional society, internally you have urban to urban migration. So people are moving from one city to another. This is where people are getting more and more educated, more sophisticated, and they may move from one city to another just to get a different job, but they're often high-level jobs. So urban to urban migration is surpassing rural to urban migration, which leads us to believe that rural to urban migration has already happened. Okay, people have already moved from the country into the city, And people are going to always move. They're always going to be looking for somewhere different. They're always going to be getting different jobs, having different reasons to move to different cities, to different places. And at this point in the game, it's usually from city to city, urban to urban. And internationally, we have net out-migration beginning to be surpassed by net in-migration, meaning you're getting to a point in your country where people don't want to leave. People are finding good opportunities. And so what you have is more people moving into your country who want those opportunities. 5 points if you know what this is. All right, continuing on with the migration transition model. Should be able to read this a little bit better. I apologize for the technical error. Stage 4 is an advanced society where you have internally rural to urban migration continuing, but it is reduced. Why is it reduced? Well, because there's just not that many people living in rural areas to even move at this point. Most people are living in an urban setting. And internationally, more and more net in migration. Okay, internationally, people are continuing to move into your country. And as with the other transition models, there's a possible stage 5, which we would call future super advanced society, where internally almost all migration is interurban and intra-urban, so between cities and within cities. Pretty much everybody has left the countryside at this point, at least everyone who's going to, and all movement is between cities. And internationally, just more of the same, continued rising levels of net in migration. Just to give you a picture of how dramatic this is, even now, the top 10 countries by net migration, so the top 10 countries that people are moving into, you see the United States is far and away above the rest as far as how many people are migrating here. Part of that is just how big of a country we are, how many cities we have that people can migrate to. But the other part is opportunity. People see a lot of opportunity. And as we heard with the podcast we listened to, or at least we heard a sliver of this, it's not always what people think it's going to be until they get here. But it can be said that a lot of people have moved here and done quite well, though a lot of people move here and don't. So we'll take a look at that, the realities of migration versus the hopes and what people think they're going to find. But the numbers are significant here. Spain is kind of a surprise, right? And this may possibly be due to its proximity to North Africa, where you're having a lot of migration out of, a lot of emigration. All right, that is it. If there are any questions, please bring them to class and we'll talk about them.